Three men cornered her on a mountain trail miles from the nearest road. They thought they'd found an easy target, a young nurse in hiking boots with nothing but a dog and a day pack. The first one grabbed her arm. She broke his wrist before he finished laughing. The second rushed her. He hit the ground in 4 seconds flat. The third reached for the knife on his belt. And that's when the dog moved. 10 seconds. 3 men down. And the woman standing in the mountain silence wasn't breathing hard at all. She was calculating. Because what she'd just found hidden in their truck was going to change everything. If this story already has you gripped, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Emily Norris drove toward Harlan Ridge, the sky was the color of old iron. Not the dramatic kind of gray that makes people stop and take photographs. Just flat, heavy cloud cover pressing down on the tree line, like it had somewhere better to be. She had the window cracked even though the temperature outside hovered near 40 degrees, because she needed the cold air on her face. It was the only thing keeping her alert after a 12-hour overnight shift in the emergency department. She'd worked 4 of those in a row. Her coffee was lukewarm in the cup holder. She hadn't eaten since the granola bar she'd inhaled at 2 in the morning between a stabbing victim and a cardiac arrest. The stabbing victim had lived. The cardiac arrest had not, and that one was sitting somewhere behind her sternum in a place she hadn't figured out how to reach yet. From the back seat, Rex shifted his weight and exhaled the way he always did on long drives. A slow, steady breath that somehow made everything feel slightly more manageable. He was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, with a face that had always looked more serious than his mood. He'd been decorated twice during his active service years. Now he had a foam orthopedic mat in the back seat of Emily's truck and a rawhide chew she'd bought at the gas station 30 miles back. She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He was watching the trees scroll by, ears relaxed, comfortable. "We're almost there," she told him. He didn't react. He never needed reassurance. That was one of the things she liked most about him. Emily Norris was 29 years old. She had dark brown hair she kept pulled back in a knot most days, brown eyes that people sometimes described as intense before they got to know her, and the kind of quietly efficient manner that made her good at 2 very different jobs. For the past 2 years, she'd been an ER nurse at Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center in the town of Caldwell, a mid-sized city 3 hours south of where she was now. Before that, for 6 years, she had been something else entirely. Something that didn't appear anywhere on her nursing resume and that she had not discussed with a single person in Caldwell. She'd been a combat medic and close-quarters combat instructor attached to a classified forward deployment unit operating in environments that didn't make it onto the evening news. She had treated injuries that no field manual covered adequately. She had kept men alive in conditions where the honest statistical probability was that they would die. And she had done the other thing, too. The thing she thought about even less than the rest of it. She had been good at that. Uncomfortably good, in the way that competence in a dark skill always sits uncomfortably once you step away from the context that made it necessary. She had stepped away. She had gone back to school, earned her nursing credentials, and built a quiet life. She was good at her job. Her coworkers liked her, though most admitted she was hard to read. Her supervisor, a thorough and occasionally exhausting administrator named Donald Whitfield, had written in her last performance review that she was efficient, technically excellent, and somewhat difficult to engage informally. She'd read that and thought it was probably fair. She didn't talk about before. She'd learned it was easier that way. The trail she was heading for was called the Harlan Ridge Loop, 14 miles of switchback terrain running through federal wilderness land above 3,000 feet. She'd done it twice before, both times alone except for Rex, and both times it had done what she needed it to do, which was fill her head with something immediate and physical until the noise from the hospital faded into something manageable. She parked at the trailhead lot just after 8 in the morning. There were 2 other vehicles, a battered pickup she didn't recognize, and a Forest Service truck that had been sitting long enough to collect a fine layer of pine dust on the hood. She locked her truck, clipped Rex's lead, and they started walking. For the first 2 hours, it was exactly what she needed. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth pine and Douglas fir, the air sharp and resinous, the ground soft with years of needle fall. Rex moved beside her at a controlled heel. He never really stopped working, just shifted into a lower gear. She set a pace that required just enough effort to quiet her brain, not sprinting, not casual, the zone where the body runs the show and the mind takes a back seat. She thought about the cardiac arrest, briefly, let it surface, and then release. 44 years old, no prior history, collapsed in the parking lot of a grocery store. There had been nothing more to do. That was the true thing she had to keep returning to when cases didn't go the way she wanted. That she'd done what was available to be done, and sometimes the outcome is already written before the medic arrives. She'd learned that early, the hard way, the way most people learn things that matter. By mile 6, she'd stopped thinking about much of anything. That was the point. The trail bent west around the 9-mile marker, dropping slightly toward a flat section that ran along a dry creek bed before climbing again toward the ridge. It was quiet. A pair of ravens called somewhere in the canopy. Rex's ears pricked once, tracked something in the tree line, then settled, probably a deer. His posture stayed casual. She heard them before she saw them. Male voices, loud and carrying in the still air. Not the normal volume of hikers talking to each other across a distance, something with an edge in it, the particular social pitch of men performing for each other. She'd heard it before in a lot of different contexts, and it always meant the same thing. Someone was showing off, and at least one other person was being encouraged to find it funny. She came around a bend in the trail and saw them. 3 men were standing in the middle of the path where it widened near the creek crossing. They were in their late 20s to mid-30s, dressed in hunting camo that still had the store creases in it, which told her something. Real hunters didn't dress like that. One of them was heavy-set with a shaved head and a patchy beard. Another was lean and fidgety, the kind of restless energy that suggested stimulants or just a naturally wired temperament. The third was the tallest of the 3, wearing a baseball cap with the bill turned backward, and he was the one talking. There was a truck parked 50 yards off the trail on the fire access road. A dark green pickup, older model, backed in against the tree line. Emily assessed all of this in approximately 2 seconds. Rex had gone very still beside her. She kept walking. Her body language was neutral, gaze forward, pace unchanged. The fastest way through was the fastest way through. "Hey!" The tall one moved to center trail. She stopped, kept maybe 15 feet between them. "Trail's public," she said. Flat, polite. No heat in it. "Yeah, we know." The heavy-set one grinned. "We're just having a conversation." She waited. "Where are you headed?" the tall one asked. He was looking at Rex with an expression she cataloged as calculating. Not afraid of the dog, but assessing him. That was the more concerning response, in her experience. "Finishing the loop," she said. "I'll go around you." She moved a step off the trail edge, and the tall one shifted with her, blocking. "Relax," he said. "We're being friendly." Rex made no sound. He was watching the tall one with absolute focus, every muscle in his body quiet and gathered. Anyone who knew working dogs would have recognized that stillness for what it was. These 3 men did not know working dogs. "Nice dog," the lean one said. "What's he worth?" And there it was. "He's not for sale," Emily said. "Didn't ask if he was for sale." The lean one looked at the tall one, and they exchanged a grin. "Asked what he's worth." The heavy-set one started moving sideways, slow and casual, getting around her left flank. She tracked him in her peripheral vision without turning her head. "Last chance," she said quietly. "Walk away." The tall one laughed. Not a small laugh, a full, delighted laugh. The kind that invites the other 2 to laugh with him. They did. "Last chance," he mimicked, falsetto. "Did she just—" "Walk away," she said again. Same tone. Not angry, not afraid, just informational. The tall one reached for Rex's leash. What happened in the next 11 seconds was not dramatic in the way people imagined violence to be dramatic. There was no telegraphing, no wind-up, no trading of words. Emily moved. That was the simple version of it. She moved, and she was precise, and she was fast in the specific way that training at that level produces. Not athletic fast, but efficient fast, where every motion does exactly what it needs to do and nothing is wasted. The tall one's wrist broke at the point of contact. He went down on one knee, making a sound between a bark and a gasp. The lean one rushed her from the right. She was already turning. Elbow strike, hip rotation, takedown. He hit the dirt path face first and stayed there, consciousness departing without fanfare. The heavy-set one had his hand inside his jacket. She gave him 1 second to make a decision. He didn't make the right one. Rex was already moving on her command. A single syllable, barely audible. And 85 pounds of Belgian Malinois hit the heavy-set man's forearm before the gun cleared the holster. The man went down hard. Rex held the grip. The gun skittered into the pine needles off the trail edge. 11 seconds. Emily was breathing normally. Her hands were steady. She stood in the middle of the trail and looked at the 3 men on the ground and felt the particular hollow stillness she always felt in the aftermath. Not satisfaction, not discomfort, just a kind of functional quiet. Rex, aus? Release command, German, the way he'd been trained. He released and came back to heel immediately, sitting at her left side. He was barely panting. She pulled the restraint from her pack. She carried zip ties on hikes, which her coworkers would have found strange and she'd never bothered to explain, and secured the lean one first because he was starting to stir, then moved to the heavy-set one, then the tall one who was still cradling his wrist and making a lot of noise about it. "You broke my wrist," the tall one said, like this was a thing she might have forgotten. "I know," she said. "Stop moving it. Who the hell are you? Someone you should have walked away from." She finished securing his wrist behind his back, checked his pockets, found a folding knife, a burner phone, and a key fob for the green pickup on the fire road. She looked at the truck. In her experience, when people parked backed in on access roads in the middle of nowhere, they were usually either hunting or doing something they didn't want anyone to see them doing. And these men had not been dressed for hunting in any way that suggested they actually intended to hunt. "Rex, stay," she said. She walked the 50 yards to the green pickup. The windows were rolled up. She pressed her face to the glass on the passenger side and looked into the truck bed through the rear window. There was a blue tarp back there, bunched up and secured with rope at the corners. She tried the tailgate. Unlocked. She pulled back a corner of the tarp. Then she went very still. Beneath the tarp were 8 green crates, military issue, stenciled with lot numbers and handling codes she recognized immediately. Not because she'd seen them on any civilian job site or in any training manual, because she'd seen them in the field. She'd packed and transported similar crates herself years ago in places she never talked about. She replaced the tarp corner precisely as she'd found it and stepped back from the truck. Military-grade plastic explosives, 8 crates of it. And given the handling codes and the stenciling, it hadn't been decommissioned or surplus sold. The handling codes were current, which meant these crates had come from somewhere they were not supposed to leave. She walked back to the 3 men on the trail. The tall one had stopped complaining about his wrist and was watching her with a different expression now. The bluster was gone. Something else had replaced it. "Who are you moving it for?" she asked. Silence. She crouched in front of him. "I found the crates. I know what they are. I'm going to ask you once more, and the quality of your answer is going to affect what happens to you in the next few hours considerably." The tall one swallowed. His eyes cut sideways to the heavy-set man who had his face turned away. "You have no idea what you just walked into," the tall one said, and his voice had changed completely. The performance was gone. What was underneath it was something close to genuine fear. "You need to let us go and walk the other way, right now." "That's not going to happen," Emily said. "There are more coming." He wasn't posturing now. His voice was low and fast, the way people talked when they were trying to communicate something real. "A lot more. Armed. They're already on the way. You need to go." She studied his face. The fear in it was not manufactured. "How many?" she said. He shook his head. "Just go. Take your dog and go." She stood up. She looked down the fire access road which curved out of sight around a stand of old Douglas fir. The road was gravel, which meant she'd hear vehicles before she saw them. She pulled out her phone. No signal. She'd known that before she came up here, had mentally filed it as a non-issue. She looked at the truck. She looked at the crates. She looked at the 3 men on the ground. She had an emergency satellite communicator in her pack. She'd carried it since her field days and had never stopped, the same way she'd never stopped carrying the zip ties and the small individual trauma kit and the other items that fit in less space than most people's snack pouches. She'd never needed to use the communicator in a civilian context. She had a feeling that was about to change. She retrieved it from her pack. The device was small, matte black, with a single dedicated button for encrypted emergency broadcast. She pressed it. The signal went. Satellite confirmation, 3 seconds. The device had no display to confirm receipt, but she knew the protocol. The signal would route through 2 relay nodes and land at a federal emergency coordination center with her GPS coordinates attached. Response would depend on who was monitoring and how busy the day was. She put the communicator back in her pack. The tall one had watched her. "What did you just do?" "Something that needed doing." "You have no idea." "Tell me what kind of timeline we're on," she said. He pressed his lips together. The heavyset one spoke instead, suddenly, from the ground. 40 minutes, maybe less. 6 men minimum, probably more. They were staging at the lower access gate when we left. He paused. "They have rifles." Emily looked at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The tall one turned to the heavyset man. "What the hell?" "Shut up, Garrett." The heavyset one's voice was tired. "Just shut up. It's over." Emily looked down the road again. The ravens were gone. The forest had gone quiet the way it sometimes did before weather came in, or before something disrupted the normal pattern of things. 40 minutes. She looked at the terrain around her. She'd hiked this section twice, and she knew it. The creek bed to the east, the ridge above with its clear sight lines, the dense second-growth timber on the north slope that would slow any approach. The fire access road came in from the south, and there was no other vehicle route to this position. She looked at Rex. He was watching her, waiting. There were things in the forest that a team of armed men with rifles wasn't going to be able to account for if they didn't know the terrain and didn't know what they were walking into. She pulled her pack back on. "You're staying?" The tall one, Garrett, stared at her. "Are you out of your mind?" Emily reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and checked the compact fixed blade she'd carried since her second deployment. Habit. It was there. "They're coming to recover those crates," she said, not really to the men on the ground, but more to herself, working through it. "They're not going to find them unattended." She looked at the truck, at the explosives, at the fire road. She looked at the tree line. "Rex," she said quietly. He rose from his sit immediately, every muscle alert, reading her shift in posture the way he always could. She moved toward the tree line on the north slope, and the dog moved with her, and the forest swallowed them both in less than 30 seconds. The 3 men on the trail were left behind, zip-tied and staring at an empty path, listening to the sound of their own breathing and the distant growing rumble of vehicles coming up the gravel access road from the south. The rumble grew louder. Emily moved fast through the timber, low and deliberate, picking her footing without looking down. Rex stayed at her left, matching her pace exactly, no commands needed. They'd trained together long enough that he read her body the way a good partner reads a partner, through weight and angle and breath, the small signals that didn't require words. She put 200 yards between herself and the trail before she stopped. She chose a position on the north slope where the timber thinned enough to give her sightlines down to the fire access road and across to the truck, but dense enough that no one looking up from the road would pick her out. She pressed her back against a Douglas fir with a trunk wide enough to matter and controlled her breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The cold air helped. It always had. Rex sat at her heel. His ears were rotating, cataloging sounds. She watched his body for information. 2 vehicles. She could tell by the engine noise. 2 distinct sounds, slightly out of phase with each other, both heavy, both pushing up the grade faster than was comfortable on gravel. Not cautious. Whoever was in those vehicles wasn't worried about what was waiting for them. They expected to find 3 men and a truck and 8 crates and nothing else. That was going to be an adjustment. The first SUV came around the tree-line bend, and she got her first look at them. Black, newer model, high-clearance suspension. Government plate style, but no markings. The kind of vehicle that was meant to read as official from a distance while being technically civilian. The second one followed 10 seconds behind. Same make, same color, windows tinted dark. Both stopped on the fire road, engines idling. She counted the doors. 6 men out of the first vehicle. She watched them. The way they moved, the way they spread, the way they handled the rifles that three of them were already carrying. These were not the same class as the three men on the trail. The trail crew had been opportunistic, sloppy, hired for muscle. This group moved with the kind of practice spacing and mutual awareness that came from actual training, private contractor level, at minimum, possibly higher. The sixth man out of the first vehicle was the one she immediately focused on. He walked to the front of the SUV and stood there rather than spreading with the others, which meant he was directing rather than clearing. Medium height, compact build, wearing tactical clothing in muted gray rather than black. He had no rifle. He had a sidearm on his right hip and a radio in his left hand. Command element. 4 more men out of the second vehicle. 10 total. She watched the command element walk to where Garrett and the other two were zip-tied on the ground. He crouched in front of Garrett, and she was too far to hear the conversation, but she could read the body language. The commander was calm. Garrett was talking fast. The commander listened for about 30 seconds, then stood up and looked at the tree line. He turned a slow, complete circle, scanning. She didn't move, didn't breathe any louder. Rex beside her was a statue. The commander raised his radio. She couldn't hear what he said, but within 30 seconds, 4 of the 10 men began moving toward the timber. 2 toward her slope, 2 toward the east side along the creek bed. She did the math quickly. She had a fixed blade and a compact personal kit and a Belgian Malinois. They had rifles and 10-to-1 numbers and communication equipment and the motivation of people who needed to recover something very expensive and incriminating before anyone official showed up. She had the terrain. And she had the clock. She needed the federal response team to arrive before this became a math problem she couldn't solve. The communicator beacon was out. The question was how long before anyone reached this position. 3 hours? Minimum, if it was a standard search and rescue dispatch. Far less, if the beacon's encrypted military routing code had flagged the right desk. She'd used that code deliberately. She knew what it would trigger. 45 minutes, maybe an hour. If the right people were monitoring, she had to make the forest difficult for 45 minutes. The 2 men heading up the north slope were moving in a standard 2-man bound. One moving, one covering, leapfrogging up the grade. They were good. They were working the angles correctly and keeping noise to a minimum, and they were going to reach her position in approximately 4 minutes if she stayed where she was. She didn't stay where she was. She moved parallel to the slope, westward, keeping the same elevation and using the larger timber as cover. Rex followed without command. She was making a decision she'd made in other contexts, in other forests, in other situations that didn't bear thinking about too carefully right now. She was choosing to move toward rather than away, because away meant upslope, and upslope meant she'd be silhouetted against the ridge and lose every advantage she currently had. Toward meant the timber stayed dense. Toward meant she controlled the encounter. She positioned herself behind a downed log with enough diameter to provide genuine cover, not just concealment, and waited. Rex dropped flat at her side, pressed against the log. His breathing was so controlled she could barely feel it. She heard them before she saw them. Boot on loose rock, a small sound, but it was enough. She placed the closer man at 30 feet, coming up on her left through a gap in the second growth. The further man was 10 feet behind and slightly right, covering. She let the closer man pass her position. Then she moved. It was not combat in the cinematic sense. There were no dramatic exchanges. She came off the log and closed the distance before the man completed his next scan rotation, and she was efficient and precise, and the man went down without ever getting a clear look at what had hit him. She caught his rifle before it struck the log and made noise. The second man had 2 seconds before he registered that his partner was down. That was 1 second more than she needed. Rex had already moved on a hand signal, not a verbal. She'd trained him to work in noise discipline environments, and that training had not degraded in his retirement years. The second man went down. She was on him before he recovered, controlled him, and had his radio off his vest in 8 seconds. She listened to the radio. 2 channels. The command element was talking on the second channel, coordinating the sweep pattern. She couldn't transmit without them identifying her as an interloper, but she could listen, and listening told her that the other 2-man team on the east slope had not yet made contact with anything. She had a window. She moved the 2 men off the slope route and secured them with their own equipment. The contractors came with zip restraints on their vests, which told her something about the operations planning level. And then she and Rex moved again. Back down the slope, angling south, staying in the timber, moving toward the truck. The truck was the center of the problem. The crates were what they'd come for. As long as those crates were in that truck, the commander had a reason to stay and push the search. She needed to change his calculation. She came out of the timber on the truck's blind side, the east, away from where the SUVs were parked and where the remaining 8 men were operating. She went to the tailgate. The keys were on Garrett's person, which meant the truck was locked. She looked at the crates through the tailgate window. Military-grade plastic explosive in unmarked crates with current handling codes, sitting in a civilian pickup truck on a federal wilderness access road. She knew exactly what this was. She'd seen procurement fraud before, in environments where the oversight was thin and the money was significant, and the people involved believed they were operating in a space where consequences didn't apply to them. Someone had moved these crates out of a secured military facility. Someone with access. The 3 men on the trail were the delivery end of a chain that started somewhere with a badge and a clearance level. The commander and his team were the insurance policy, the cleanup crew dispatched to make sure the crates either completed their intended journey or disappeared entirely, along with anyone who'd seen them. She needed these crates to stay exactly where they were until the response team arrived. She moved back into the timber. The radio on the commander's channel crackled. She heard him ask for a status check from Team 1, the 2 men she'd taken down on the north slope. Silence. He asked again. More silence. His voice shifted fractionally, a tightening in the cadence that a person who'd worked at command level would recognize. He knew something was wrong. He called Team 2, the east slope pair. They answered. They were still working the creek bed, nothing to report. He said something she didn't catch, and then the radio on the team frequency went quiet, which meant he'd switched to a private channel. She looked at Rex. He was watching the trees toward where Team 2 was working the creek, ears up, muscles loose and ready. She thought about the math again. She'd taken 2 of 10. 8 remained, including the commander, and the commander had just realized his sweep team wasn't checking in, which meant he was about to consolidate rather than spread, pull everyone back to the truck, secure the asset, and wait to understand what he was dealing with. That was the tactically sound response. She would have done the same. Consolidated meant 8 men around one truck in an open fire road clearing. That was a problem she couldn't solve directly. She needed them not to consolidate. She needed them uncertain and spread out and focused on the wrong things. She looked at the terrain above the access road, where the ridge broke and the rock face came down in a series of natural shelves. She'd noticed those shelves when she'd done this trail before. Good place to watch the valley from. Exposed, the kind of feature your eye went to automatically. She needed their eyes to go there. She picked up a rock. She threw it upslope, away from her position, into the timber above the ridge shelf. It cracked through branches and skipped off a rock face loud enough to carry in the forest quiet. On the radio, Team 2 stopped moving. She heard one of them say something short and sharp, and then the channel went quiet as they also switched frequency. She was already moving again, east, dropping toward the creek bed, circling behind Team 2's last position. Rex tracked with her, feet finding the quiet ground between the rocks, without instruction. She heard Team 2 before she reached them, 2 men who had stopped moving and were watching the ridge above, rifles raised, waiting for whatever had made the noise to show itself. Their backs were to the creek. Their backs were to her. She assessed the gap, the angles, the footing. She chose the closer man first because he was the one with the radio. 30 seconds later, Team 2 was no longer a factor. She stood in the creek bed with 4 of 10 accounted for and 8 seconds of radio silence before the commander tried his check-in again. When nobody answered from either team, she heard his voice change completely on the open channel. A short, clipped transmission that was more command than communication, and then the sound of boots on gravel as the remaining 6 men moved from spread positions back toward the truck. She'd expected that. She was already repositioning. The timber on the south side of the clearing was thinner, younger growth, less cover, but she didn't need cover for what she was doing next. She needed the angle. She moved to the edge of the tree line, still in shadow, and watched the 6 men consolidate around the pickup truck and the 2 black SUVs. The commander stood in the center of the group. He was talking, low and fast, and she watched the body language of the men around him shift from search posture to defensive posture. They were oriented outward now, watching the timber from the truck's position. Alert, weapons up, looking for contact. He turned again, that same slow scan he'd done before. His eyes swept the south tree line. She was still. Rex was still. He didn't find her, but he was good. And she knew he was good. And she knew that 6 armed men in a defensible position around a truck was a static problem that patience would not solve before her time ran out. She checked her watch. 31 minutes since the beacon went out. She needed more time, or she needed something to change the commander's calculation so fundamentally that he made a mistake. The first option she couldn't control. The second required information she didn't fully have yet. She looked at Garrett, still zip-tied 20 yards from the truck, watching the whole scene from the ground with the expression of a man who had deeply regretted a series of life decisions and was only just now fully processing the extent of that regret. She looked at the commander, who was positioned between Garrett and the south tree line. She looked at Rex, who was looking at her. She made a decision she wasn't entirely comfortable with. She reached into her pack and pulled out the small orange emergency whistle she'd carried as a backup signal device. It was loud, the kind of loud that carried half a mile in mountain air. She was about to use it in a way it was not designed for. She aimed her throw carefully. The whistle arced through the air and landed in the brush on the east side of the clearing with a sharp rustling crack. Every rifle on the east side of the defensive circle swung toward the sound. The commander said something sharp, and 2 men broke from the circle toward the east brush. That was 4 rifles now pointed away from her position. She moved out of the south tree line fast and low, covering the ground to the truck in a straight sprint that lasted 5 seconds. She went under the truck, on her back, in the space beneath the frame, and she pressed flat and controlled her breathing and waited. Above her, she could hear boots on gravel as the 2 men who'd gone east came back reporting nothing. The commander's voice tight and clipped, running another frequency check on the missing teams. No answer. She heard his boots 6 feet from where she was lying. Rex had gone to ground in the tree line, 3 hand signals back, holding a stay she knew he'd hold until she released him or until the situation changed in a way that required him to make an independent decision. He'd been trained for exactly that. She trusted it completely. The commander stopped walking. She could see his boots from under the truck. He stood still for a long moment. Then she heard it. Distant at first. The mechanical rhythm of rotors. 1 aircraft, then 2. Coming in fast from the south. The sound that changed everything. The commander heard it too. She heard him say one word, quiet and flat, the way people spoke when they understood that something was finished. The word was, move. And that was when the armored vehicles hit the access road. She heard the gate blow before she saw anything. A single sharp crack, metal on metal, the sound of a vehicle hitting the lower access barrier at speed without slowing down. Then the gravel roar of multiple heavy vehicles pushing up the grade fast, not the tentative approach of people who weren't sure what they were driving into, but the committed momentum of people who knew exactly what was here and had come prepared for it. The commander shouted something. Around the truck, she heard the remaining 6 men moving, boots on gravel, the scrape of equipment. She stayed under the truck. Rex was in the tree line. She'd given him the hold signal. She trusted it. The first armored vehicle came around the bend in the access road, and she saw it from underneath the truck chassis. Heavy tires, blacked-out rims, the undercarriage profile of a vehicle built to take hits. It stopped 40 yards short of the pickup, and the doors opened and boots hit the ground moving. And these were not the same kind of boots as the commander's men. These were Federal tactical. She could tell by the cadence, the spacing, the particular way they fanned without anyone calling out commands, because they drilled the spacing until it was automatic. A second vehicle behind the first. A third behind that. She counted feet from her position under the truck. 12, 14, more. She stopped counting and focused on reading the tactical geometry instead. The Federals were establishing a perimeter that started at the vehicles and pushed outward, and the commander's remaining 6 men were caught inside it, which meant the commander had waited 2 seconds too long to make his move, and now he was out of options. She heard the first challenge call. Federal identification, loud and clear, instructing all personnel to ground their weapons and show hands. A long pause. Then the sound of rifles being set on gravel. 1, 2, 5, 6. The commander was the last. She heard his weapon go down and the particular sound of a man lowering himself to his knees, who understood that the math had turned completely against him. She gave it 45 seconds. Long enough for the perimeter to be established, for the immediate threat to be controlled, for the chaos to settle into something with a structure. Then she rolled out from under the truck on the south side, came up to her feet, and brushed the gravel off her jacket. The nearest federal agent, black tactical vest, carbine at low ready, spun toward her immediately, weapon coming up. "Hands," he said. "I'm the one who called it in," she said. Her hands were up, open, steady. "Emily Norris. I'm unarmed. My dog is in the tree line, south side, holding a stay command. His name is Rex. He will not move unless I call him." The agent looked at her for a half second. The assessment all tactical operators did when they encountered something that didn't fit the expected picture. A woman in hiking gear with dried pine needles on her jacket standing next to a military explosives truck was not what the briefing had described. "Don't move," he said, and called something over his radio. She didn't move. 30 seconds later, a different figure approached from the lead vehicle. Taller, no carbine, wearing a vest with federal identification in yellow letters across the chest. He had the look of a man who'd been in the field long enough that the gear was just clothing to him. Nothing self-conscious about it. He stopped in front of her. "You're Norris?" he said. "Yes." "You sent the beacon?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the truck. Then he looked at the 4 locations around the perimeter where his people were securing the men she'd handled in the timber and the creek bed. "You took down 6 of them?" he said. "4, she said. "The 3 on the trail were already restrained when you arrived. Rex handled one of those." He looked at the dog, who had appeared at the tree line the moment she'd spoken his name, sitting calmly, waiting. "What's in the truck?" he said, though she had the impression he already knew. 8 crates, military issue, current handling codes, plastic explosive. I didn't disturb them beyond confirming what they were. He studied her face. "You've seen that type of crate before." It wasn't a question. "Once or twice," she said. He held her gaze for another moment, then pulled out a radio and began relaying information to someone on a different channel. She caught fragments: asset secured, multiple subjects in custody, requesting EOD and military liaison, confirmation of beacon credentials requested. That last part, beacon credentials, was the piece she'd known was coming. The communicator she carried wasn't a civilian model. It wasn't available for purchase. It operated on an encrypted military frequency, and the registration code attached to it was tied to a service record that she had not discussed with anyone in Caldwell, not her coworkers, not her supervisor, not the people she occasionally had dinner with who considered her a friend in the limited way that people with limited personal disclosure could be considered friends. The federal agent finished his transmission and looked at her again with a slightly different expression. "Someone wants to talk to you," he said. "I assumed they would," she said. "Yes." They set up a field command post at the lower end of the access road, where it widened enough to turn vehicles around. By the time Emily walked down with the lead agent, whose name turned out to be Harlan Voss, out of a federal counterterrorism task force she'd heard of but never directly interfaced with, there were 11 vehicles on the access road and more coming up from the highway. EOD had arrived in a separate truck and was already working the pickup. Military liaison had arrived in 2 unmarked sedans and was establishing a separate chain of communication on their own equipment. Rex walked at her heel through all of it, unbothered by the vehicles and the personnel and the controlled chaos the way working dogs were unbothered by things that had been trained into the category of normal. She sat on the running board of one of the federal vehicles and drank water from a bottle someone handed her and watched the operation expand around the access road clearing. The commander, she still didn't know his name, was zip-tied and seated against the tire of a federal vehicle 40 yards away. He had not looked at her since the perimeter established. She looked at him once and then didn't look again. Garrett was being processed separately, which meant they'd already separated the subjects and were working the identification and interrogation pipeline in parallel. Good. That was the right call. Garrett was a talker, and a separate interview before he had time to coordinate with the others would produce more usable information. Voss came back 20 minutes after he'd left her. "EOD confirms the crates," he said, sitting down on the running board beside her with the tired ease of someone who'd been moving fast for too long. 14 units of military-grade C4, 2 units of what they're calling an experimental compound that nobody's explaining to me yet. All of it with current military lot numbers. Stolen from a facility, she said. That would be the working theory, yes. He looked at her sidelong. You ID'd the handling codes immediately. The format's distinctive if you've worked with it. Where did you work with it? She looked at him. I think you probably already know the answer to that. He was quiet for a moment. The beacon registration pulled a file. Most of it is classified above my clearance level, which is not a small clearance level. He paused. The parts I could see were informative. I'm a nurse, she said. ER at Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center in Caldwell. That's what I am now. Yes, he said. That's in the file too. He didn't say it with any skepticism. He said it the way someone acknowledged a true fact. The parts of your file I could access, the parts that weren't blacked out, listed a number of operational qualifications and a commendation citation that I'd only seen once before on someone who was considerably more senior than 29 years old. She didn't respond to that. I'm not asking you to open the file, he said. I'm trying to understand what I'm dealing with, because in about 40 minutes I'm going to have to brief someone significantly above my pay grade on what happened on this mountain today. And the most honest version of that briefing includes the fact that one person and a retired military dog neutralized 6 armed private contractors and secured a stolen military explosives cache. He paused. I'd like to have some framework for that. The framework is that I went for a hike, she said. I encountered an assault in progress, responded to it, discovered evidence of a serious federal crime, and activated an emergency beacon. Everything after that was trained response to conditions as they developed. Voss looked at her for a long moment. That's a very compact description of what happened. It covers the material facts. He almost smiled. It does, he agreed. He got up and went back to managing his operation. She sat on the running board and Rex put his head on her knee, which he rarely did. She put her hand on his head and felt the solidity of him there, and breathed. She was cold, she realized. The adrenaline had been managing the temperature for the last 2 hours, and now that the immediate problem was resolved, her body was submitting an accounting of what the morning had cost. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. But the rest of her was registering the cold and the hunger and the particular deep tiredness that came after this kind of sustained focus. She needed food. She needed somewhere warm. She needed eventually to drive 3 hours back to Caldwell and sleep for 10 hours before her next shift. She was not going to get any of those things for a while yet. A figure came down the access road from the upper clearing. Not one of the federal tactical agents. Different bearing, different uniform. Military. She tracked him as he approached Voss and spoke to him, and Voss turned and pointed at her. The figure changed course and came toward her. He was a colonel. She read the rank insignia automatically, the way she always did with military personnel. And he was perhaps 55, lean, with the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent a significant portion of their career outdoors in difficult conditions. He walked like someone who had once been in very good shape and had maintained most of it. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment. Staff Sergeant Norris, he said. She hadn't heard that rank used in 2 years. I'm a nurse, she said. I go by Emily. I know what you go by now, he said. He had a measured, quiet way of speaking that she recognized. The cadence of people who had learned to communicate precisely in environments where imprecision had consequences. I was briefed on your separation. I wasn't briefed on your posting to Caldwell. It wasn't a posting, she said. It was a personal decision. He nodded once, looked at Rex. That's Vega. Rex's ears moved slightly at the name. He goes by Rex, she said. I know. He was in your separation documentation. He paused. You formally adopted him. When his handler... She stopped, started again. When his previous handler was no longer able to care for him. Yes. The colonel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly different. The formal layer thinned a little. His previous handler was a good man. Yes, she said. He was. They stood with that for a moment, which was the right amount of time to stand with it. There are going to be questions, he said. Not from me, from people above me. The material in that truck is connected to an ongoing investigation that's been running for 8 months. Military procurement fraud, weapons diversion, a supply chain that goes several levels higher than those crates. He looked at the upper clearing where the EOD team was working. What you found today, what you secured today, is material evidence in a case that has been, to put it professionally, extremely difficult to build. She looked at him. How high does it go? He met her eyes. High enough that the people involved believed they were untouchable. She thought about the handling codes, the current lot numbers, the fact that someone with facility access and clearance had moved 16 units of military explosives onto a civilian truck on a wilderness access road. They're going to know the crates were recovered, she said. They already know. The commander's team had a check-in protocol. When the check-in didn't happen, whoever is at the top of this chain will understand that something went wrong. He paused. Which means the next 72 hours are going to be significant. She thought about Caldwell, about Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center, about her apartment and her shift schedule, and the quiet life she had built that she had worked hard to build and that she did not want disrupted. She looked at Rex. Am I going to be able to go home? She said. The colonel looked at her steadily. I think you're going to be asked to stay on site tonight, for the debrief. After that, he paused, and something in his expression shifted, something careful. After that, I think there are going to be some conversations about your situation that you may not have anticipated when you came up here this morning. She felt the particular weight of that sentence, the way it contained several things at once. I came up here for a hike, she said. I know, he said, and she heard in his voice something she hadn't expected, something that was close to apology. I'm sorry that it became something else. She looked up at the ridge. The clouds had shifted while she was under the truck, and a strip of weak winter sun was coming through, painting the rock face above the tree line in pale gold. Rex pressed his head against her knee again. She reached down and put her hand on his neck. Somewhere up the access road, she heard a federal agent calling out a confirmation number for the crates, his voice businesslike and carrying in the mountain cold. She heard the EOD team responding. She heard the ordinary sounds of an operation doing what operations did, documenting, securing, processing, working the problem forward. She thought about the cardiac arrest patient from 2 nights ago, 44 years old, no prior history. She thought about the way the morning had started, the cold air through the window, the lukewarm coffee, Rex's steady breathing from the back seat. She thought about what the colonel had said, conversations you may not have anticipated. She didn't ask him what he meant. She already had a reasonable idea, and she wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. Not on a gravel access road in the cold, with pine needles still in her hair, and her hands smelling like mountain air and the specific residue of a morning she hadn't planned for. She'd handle it when it came. She always did. When does the debrief start? She said. An hour, the colonel said. Maybe less. She nodded, stood up, rolled her shoulders once, feeling the stiffness settling in where the adrenaline had held it at bay. I need to feed my dog, she said. He worked this morning. The colonel looked at Rex. Something moved across his face that was almost warm. There's food in the command vehicle. I'll have someone bring it. Thank you, she said. He turned to go, then stopped, half turned back. Norris, he said. She looked at him. What you did up here today? He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who didn't use them carelessly. It mattered. I want you to know that. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at Rex, who was watching her with his calm, serious face and his relaxed ears and his complete, uncomplicated steadiness. Come on, she told him. Let's get you something to eat. They walked toward the command vehicle together, the dog and the nurse. While behind them, the federal operation expanded through the mountain clearing and the winter sun moved across the ridge, and somewhere in the chain of accountability that ran from those 8 crates all the way to a desk in a secured facility, someone who had believed themselves untouchable was beginning to understand that the morning had gone very, very wrong. The food they brought for Rex was a field ration protein pack that he ate without complaint, which told her he was hungry enough not to be particular about it. She gave him water from her bottle, let him finish, and then they walked together to the command vehicle. A converted cargo truck with fold-out tables and screens, and the particular smell of electronic equipment and cold coffee that she associated with a specific category of long day. The debrief started without ceremony. There were 4 people across the table from her. Voss, the colonel, whose name she learned was Aldrich Morrow, a woman from a federal prosecutorial office who introduced herself only as Supervisory Agent Dana Reeves, and a man in civilian clothes who did not introduce himself at all, and whose presence Morrow acknowledged with a look that told Emily he was from somewhere that didn't advertise. She filed that information and let it sit. They went through it methodically. Timeline, observations, decisions made, and why. She answered every question directly and without elaboration, the way she'd been trained to debrief. Factual, sequential, no editorializing. Rex lay at her feet under the table and occasionally shifted position. Nobody commented on the dog being in the command vehicle. Reeves was the most focused of the 4. She had a narrow, precise way of asking questions that stripped out everything except the load-bearing information, and Emily found herself respecting it. "When you identified the crates," Reeves said, "what was your immediate assessment of origin?" "Active military facility. The handling codes aren't format compatible with decommissioned stock. The lot sequencing is different. What was in that truck left a secured installation within the last 30 days. How confident are you in that assessment? Confident enough to have activated the beacon rather than a standard emergency line." Reeves wrote something. "You made that determination in how long?" 30 seconds, maybe less. A pause. "You want to walk me through your background with that materials classification?" Emily looked at her steadily. "That's in the file that's classified above Agent Voss's clearance level." Reeves glanced at the man with no name. He gave a small nod that Emily interpreted correctly. "We can proceed without it," Reeves said. Moving on, no friction, which meant she'd already had access to enough of the file to understand that pushing further in this room was not productive. The debrief ran 90 minutes. By the end of it, the winter light coming through the narrow command vehicle windows had shifted from pale gold to the flat gray of late afternoon. She was stiff from the folding chair, and her shoulder was starting to register the morning's activities in a way it hadn't while she was moving. Morrow walked her out when it wrapped. "There's a situation developing," he said, and his tone had changed from the careful, measured version he'd used at the access road. This was something harder under it. "The people at the top of the procurement chain, we've had eyes on 2 of them for 6 months. With the crates recovered and the commander's team in federal custody, the case has moved from probable to prosecutable. But," he stopped walking. She stopped with him. "But," she said, "the 2 principals, the people we believe authorized the diversion and arranged the sale, they're going to know this went wrong within hours, if they don't already. And when people in their position understand that a case is closing around them, they don't always respond the way you'd expect." She looked at him. "You think they'll run?" "One of them might. The other one—" He paused, and she heard something in the pause that she didn't like. "The other one has a history of eliminating problems when problems become inconvenient." She thought about that for a moment. Thought about the fact that the commander's team had check-in protocols, which meant whoever sent them would have known within the hour that the operation had failed. Thought about the fact that her name was now attached to a federal evidence chain. Thought about Caldwell. "Is there a protective situation being arranged?" she said. "It's being discussed," Morrow said, which was not the same thing as yes. "I have a job," she said. "I have patients. I have a shift rotation." "I know." He said it with the weight of someone who understood what he was asking her to give up, even temporarily. "I'm asking you to be patient with the process tonight." She looked out at the access road where the operation had shifted from tactical to procedural. Vehicles being repositioned, evidence being logged, the long, careful work of building a case from the physical record. The truck with the crates was being prepared for transport, surrounded by EOD personnel and documentation. She thought about the man with no name in the debrief room. "Who does he work for?" she said. Morrow followed her gaze, though the man wasn't visible from where they stood. Someone who's been watching this procurement chain from a different angle than Reeves's team, for longer. How much longer? Long enough that what you found today isn't a surprise to them, it's a confirmation. She processed that. They knew the crates were being moved. They suspected. They needed physical evidence to act. So they were waiting. Monitoring, he said. Which meant yes. She felt the familiar cold irritation of understanding that she'd walked into the edge of an operation someone else had been running, which was not a feeling she'd missed from her previous life. There was always a layer you didn't know about. There was always someone who had more of the picture than you did and had made decisions based on that picture that affected people who didn't have access to it. "I'd like to call my hospital," she said. "My supervisor will need to arrange coverage for my next shift." "Of course," Morrow said. She made the call from outside the command vehicle, standing in the cold with Rex beside her. Donald Whitfield answered on the third ring with the vaguely aggrieved tone he used when things deviated from the schedule he'd planned. "Norris, you're supposed to be back tomorrow night." "I know. There's been a situation. I'm going to need coverage for my Thursday shift, possibly Friday as well." A pause. "What kind of situation?" "I can't go into detail. I'm sorry, Donald. I know the timing is bad." "The timing is always bad when someone calls out," he said, which was his version of frustration. Then, after a moment, "Are you all right?" She hadn't expected the question. Whitfield was thorough and exacting and often difficult, but he wasn't unkind. She sometimes forgot that. "I'm fine," she said. "I just need a couple of days." "Take care of yourself," he said, in the same tone he used to remind staff about hand hygiene protocols. Automatic, reflexive, but genuine underneath. "We'll manage." She hung up and stood in the cold for a moment. Rex leaned his weight against her leg, which he did when he decided she needed it. She let him. The night came in fast, the way it did in the mountains in late season. By 6 o'clock, the access road was lit by field lights, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Emily had been given a meal that was better than the field ration she'd given Rex, and a jacket from a federal supply cache because hers wasn't adequate for stationary mountain cold after dark. She was sitting on a folding chair outside the command vehicle, watching the operation wind through its procedural stages, when Reeves came and sat down across from her with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had more to say and had been waiting for the right time to say it. She took the coffee. It was hot, and she wrapped her hands around it. "The commander," Reeves said without preamble. "His name is Gregor Tanis, private contractor, former special operations, cashiered out 8 years ago under circumstances that weren't made public. He's been operating in the private sector since security consulting on paper, something considerably less legitimate in practice." "He's worked for the principals before," Emily said. "Multiple times. He's their cleaner. When something in the supply chain goes wrong, he goes in and makes it not wrong." She paused. "This is the first time it hasn't worked. Because of what I found. Because of what you found and what you did with it." Reeves held her coffee with both hands and looked at Emily directly. "Tanis is talking, not much, but some. He's smart enough to understand his position and to start calculating whether cooperation changes it." "What's he giving you?" "Names so far. The supply chain intermediaries, the logistics people who move the crates from the facility to the pickup location." She paused. "Not the principals." "Not yet. He's holding that." "Because that's his leverage." "Yes." Reeves looked at her cup. "The man who didn't introduce himself, his team has been building a parallel evidence structure for 14 months. If Tanis gives up the principals, it collapses what they need for a clean prosecution at the top level. They want Tanis to stay quiet long enough for them to build to the principals independently." Emily looked at her. "So you're telling me this because your name is in the evidence chain, and that means you're going to be called as a witness," Reeves said flatly. "And I want you to understand the full shape of what you're in the middle of before that becomes relevant." Emily sat with that. The coffee was good, real coffee, not field sludge. She drank it and thought about the shape of what Reeves had described, a case that had been running for 14 months, procurement fraud at a level that required active military facility access, a cleaner with a history, a principal who eliminated inconvenient problems. "The principal who eliminates problems," she said. "Does he know my name?" Reeves was quiet for 1 second too long. "We believe the commander's team had a data package on the access road situation," she said carefully, "including the vehicle registration on your truck." Emily looked at her. My truck is parked at the trailhead. We've already sent people to your vehicle, Reeves said. It's secure. That's not what I'm asking, Reeves met her eyes. Your vehicle registration connects to your address in Caldwell. Yes, we're aware of the exposure. Emily set the coffee cup down on the ground beside her chair. She looked at Rex, who was watching her with his ears slightly forward and his head tilted at the angle that meant he was reading her. How quickly can you move on the principal? She said. That depends on Tanis and on what the other team's timeline looks like. Reeves paused. It's not hours. It might not be days. Emily nodded slowly. She was doing math again, a different kind than the math she'd done in the forest, but the same fundamental operation. Variables, probabilities, the gap between what you could control and what you couldn't. In the forest, she'd had terrain and training and the clock. Here she had neither terrain nor clock, and the training she had was exactly the wrong kind for the particular problem in front of her. She couldn't outmaneuver a man she couldn't see, in a city she'd left unprotected, while sitting in a federal command post on a mountain access road. I need to go back to Caldwell, she said. I'm not asking for permission. She said it without heat, just as information. I'm a civilian. I'm a witness. I'm willing to cooperate fully with the investigation and testify to everything I observed today. I'm also telling you that I'm going home. She paused. What protection resources can you provide in Caldwell while the prosecution timeline develops? Reeves looked at her for a moment, then she exhaled through her nose, the sound of someone recalibrating. I can have a protective detail at your address within 4 hours of your departure. Then I'd like to leave in the morning, Emily said, after any remaining debrief requirements are met. Reeves nodded once. I'll arrange it. She went back inside the command vehicle to sleep in a field cot that someone had set up in the rear section, Rex on the ground beside her, and she slept the way she'd learned to sleep in environments where conditions were imperfect, fast, deep, and with some part of her still listening. She woke at 4 in the morning, not because of noise, because of Rex. He was sitting up, alert, fully, the way he only did when something had changed in the environment in a way that his senses had registered before her conscious mind had. His ears were forward and his body was still, and his attention was fixed on the far end of the command vehicle. She was upright and had her hand on the fixed blade before she'd finished forming a coherent thought. She listened. Outside, the field operation had wound to its overnight skeleton. A few agents, a perimeter, the minimum necessary to secure the site. She could hear the low murmur of a radio somewhere and the distant idle of a generator. Normal sounds. The sounds she'd cataloged when she fell asleep and that her brain had been running against for comparison during the hours since. Rex hadn't moved. Then she heard it. Not a sound exactly. A change in the quality of the silence outside. The particular absence that happened when something that should be making ambient noise stopped making it. A vehicle idling somewhere that had been idling when she fell asleep and that was no longer idling. She moved to the side panel of the command vehicle and looked through the narrow window. The field lights on the east side of the perimeter were out. Not all of them. Just the east bank. 4 units that had been running when she went to sleep, dark now. And the darkness they left was the specific darkness of lights that had been cut rather than failed, because failed lights went out one at a time and these had gone out together. She counted the personnel she could see. 2 agents near the lead vehicle. 1 near the evidence truck. Nobody on the east perimeter. She reached for her radio. They'd given her a unit during the debrief set to the operational channel. She keyed it. East perimeter lights are down, she said, quiet and flat. I have no visual on east perimeter personnel. A beat of silence. Then Voss's voice sharpened from sleep. Say again. East bank field lights are out. 4 units. I count 0 personnel on east perimeter from my current position. Another beat. Then in a different tone entirely. All units, this is Voss. Perimeter check. East side, now. And that was when the first shot came through the command vehicle wall. She was already moving when the second shot came. Not toward the door. That was the obvious exit, and obvious exits were where people died in situations like this. She went low, grabbed Rex's collar, and put herself against the interior wall on the vehicle's blind side, the one that faced away from the east perimeter where the shots were originating. The command vehicle was armored on the sides, but she didn't know to what standard, and she wasn't going to test it by staying still. The radio in her hand erupted. Voss calling units, someone calling shots fired, another voice, cut off mid-transmission, that she didn't want to think too hard about. She keyed the radio with her thumb. Norris, interior command vehicle. I need east perimeter count and shooter position. No answer for 3 seconds. Then Voss. Shooter, possibly 2, east tree line. We have an agent down, stay inside. She looked at Rex. He was pressed against the wall beside her, body low, ears working. Not panicked. He'd been in environments with gunfire before and the training held, but his attention was absolute and directed at the east wall. Multiple shooters in the tree line. 1 agent down. The east bank lights cut deliberately, which meant this wasn't improvised. Someone had planned access, had known the perimeter layout, had cut the power to specific units before moving in. That level of preparation meant either they'd had the access road under surveillance before the federal arrival, or they had information about the site setup from a source inside the operation. She thought about the check-in protocol the commander's team had missed, thought about 14 months of a parallel investigation and the man who hadn't introduced himself, thought about a principal who eliminated problems. Someone had decided that the fastest way to manage the evidence chain was to come back for it tonight, while the federal operation was at skeleton staffing, before the crates made it to a secured facility, and before the witness attached to the beacon registration could testify to anything. The evidence truck was on the west side of the clearing. That's what they were here for, the crates. She thought through the geometry. Shooters in the east tree line, drawing attention and personnel east. The evidence truck on the west side with reduced coverage while agents responded to the shooting. Classic diversion, clean and obvious once you saw the shape of it. She keyed the radio again. Voss. The shooting is a diversion. Evidence truck on the west side is the target. You need bodies on that truck right now. A pause. She heard him processing it, heard the moment he bought it. Units 3 and 4, break east response, cover the evidence truck, move now. She was already at the command vehicle's west door. She cracked it. The clearing on this side was darker without the east field lights, but she could make out the evidence truck 40 yards west. 1 agent visible near the front bumper. Not enough, nowhere near enough if a second team was already moving through the west timber. She looked at Rex. Made the decision. Stay, she said, and hated herself slightly for it, because he didn't like the stay command in situations like this, and she could see it in the set of his jaw. But she wasn't taking him into a crossfire without tactical equipment on him, and she didn't have it. She went out the west door low and fast. The cold hit her immediately. She was in the borrowed federal jacket and her hiking clothes, and it was somewhere near freezing, and none of that mattered. She moved across the clearing in the darkness, using the parked vehicles as cover points, stopping and listening and moving again. She was halfway to the evidence truck when she heard movement in the west timber. Not from the tree line, closer than that, inside the perimeter, which meant the second team had already breached before the diversion started. They were already in. She pressed against the side of a federal SUV and waited. 2 figures emerged from the shadow between 2 parked vehicles, moving fast and low toward the evidence truck. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, and they were not announcing themselves. And the agent at the front of the evidence truck had not seen them yet because he was oriented east toward the sound of the shooting like every human instinct told him to be. She didn't have a firearm. She had a fixed blade in her hands and the element of surprise, and the element of surprise was the only one of those 3 that was going to be decisive against 2 armed men in tactical gear. She made a calculation about the angle and the distance and the order of approach, and then she moved. The first man was close enough that she was on him before he registered her in his peripheral vision. She hit him fast, controlled, taking him down without the noise that would alert the second man immediately. She caught his rifle and in the same motion put herself behind the vehicle's wheel. Well, the second man stopped. She heard him stop. The particular silence of someone who'd been moving and suddenly wasn't. He'd sensed something wrong. He hadn't seen what it was yet. Martinez, he said low, calling his partner. No answer. She heard his breathing shift. He was turning, scanning, starting to understand. She came around the front of the vehicle at ground level, under his scan height, and hit him from below before he completed the turn. He went down hard on the gravel, and she had him controlled in 4 seconds. and it was not clean. Her shoulder took the brunt of his initial resistance, and something flared in it that she was going to have words with later. But he was down, and the rifle was clear of him, and she had her knee on his back and was reaching for the flex cuffs from the first man's vest when she heard the agent at the evidence truck finally turning around. "Federal agent, freeze!" "I'm Norris," she said, breathing harder than she wanted to be. "Civilian witness. I have 2 subjects down on your west side. I need flex cuffs, and I need someone to hold this one because my shoulder is not cooperating." The agent came forward fast, assessed the situation in 2 seconds, and got his knee where hers was. She straightened up and felt the shoulder complain loudly and ignored it. On the radio, the shooting from the east tree line had stopped. She heard Voss calling for status and getting answers now, multiple voices, the operational picture coming back together. She keyed her radio. "West perimeter breach, 2 subjects down and secured. Evidence truck is intact. Norris." Voss came back immediately. "Copy that. Are you injured?" She moved her shoulder experimentally. It worked. It hurt, but it worked. "Negative, shoulder. I'm fine." But a pause, and she heard in it something she recognized. The particular quality of silence that happened when someone was reassessing a person they'd already assessed and finding that the second assessment didn't match the first. "Copy," Voss said, and his voice was different than it had been. "Good work." She walked back across the clearing toward the command vehicle. The field lights on the east bank came back on one at a time. Someone had found the cut and restored power. The clearing looked different with the lights back, ordinary in the way scenes always looked ordinary once the acute moment passed and you could see the whole frame of it. Rex was standing at the command vehicle door when she reached it. "I told you to stay," she said. He looked at her with his serious face and his unrepentant posture, and she put her hand briefly on his head and let it go. The rest of the night passed in the controlled chaos of a scene that had just doubled in complexity. 4 additional subjects in custody. 1 federal agent with a through-and-through on his left arm that was serious but not critical. She pulled medical supplies from her pack without being asked and stabilized him before the medic arrived, working fast and quiet, and nobody commented on the efficiency with which she did it because at this point they had all stopped being surprised by her. By dawn, the access road looked like a different kind of operation than it had the night before. More vehicles, a medical unit, 2 additional federal supervisors who'd driven through the night and who went directly into the command vehicle without speaking to anyone outside it. Morrow found her at 7 in the morning sitting on the running board again, drinking coffee that was finally good because someone had produced an actual maker from somewhere. Rex at her feet, eating a second protein pack with the same stoic focus he'd applied to the first. He sat down beside her and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the clearing and the vehicles and the particular organized exhaustion of a federal operation that had been through a complicated night. "The 2 subjects from the west perimeter," he said finally. "One of them is talking." She looked at him. "He's connected to the principal's direct operation, not a contractor, a direct employee." Morrow turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He's identifying the principal." "Which means Tanis's leverage just evaporated," she said, "which means the case timeline just compressed significantly." He looked at her. "The principal's name is Warren Selby, Deputy Director of Logistics and Procurement, 3rd Regional Armament Command. He's been in that position for 11 years. She absorbed that. 11 years of access, 11 years of facility clearance and supply chain authority. Long enough to build a diversion operation so embedded in normal procedure that it took 14 months of parallel investigation to see the shape of it. "Is he in custody?" she said. "He will be within the hour," Morrow said. "Reeves's team moved at first light. They're executing the warrant now." She nodded, drank her coffee, looked out at the clearing. "My name is in his file," she said. Not a question. "Your name, your vehicle registration, your address in Caldwell." Morrow paused. "His team last night had a target package. You were on it." She'd known that since the moment the east lights went out. Hearing it confirmed was different from knowing it, the way confirmed things always settled differently than suspected ones. "Is it over?" she said. "The field operation is over. The legal process is just beginning." He looked at her carefully. "You're going to be called to testify. The timeline for that is months, not weeks. In the meantime, Reeves's team wants you available for ongoing deposition as the prosecution builds. I'm a nurse, she said. I have a job. I know. He said it without any edge. Nobody is asking you to stop being a nurse. Reeves will work around your schedule. She thought about Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center, about the ER floor and the overnight shifts and the particular rhythm of a workplace that needed her. She thought about Whitfield and his performance reviews and his reflexive concern delivered in the same tone as hand hygiene reminders. She thought about who she'd been on this mountain for the last 18 hours, and who she was going to go back to being when she drove down to the highway and pointed the truck south toward Caldwell. Those two things had always been separate compartments. She'd worked hard to keep them that way. She wasn't sure, sitting on the running board in the early mountain light with her shoulder aching and pine needles she was still finding in her hair, whether the compartments were going to hold the way they had before. Rex finished his food and looked up at her. His face said nothing in particular except that he was ready for whatever came next. She put her cup down. "When can I leave?" she said. "After you sign the initial deposition documents," Morrow said. "An hour, maybe 2. And the protective detail in Caldwell. Already staged. They'll meet you at your address." She nodded. She was about to stand up when her radio crackled with Voss's voice, and the tone in it was not the operational tone she'd been hearing since yesterday morning. It was something else, something with more weight in it. "Colonel Morrow," Voss said, "I need you in the command vehicle. And bring Norris." Morrow looked at her. She looked at him. They went in. Reeves was at the table. The man with no name was at the table. There was a laptop open in front of them, and on the screen was a live feed from what appeared to be a law enforcement body camera. Shaky, real-time, clearly being broadcast directly from wherever Reeves's warrant team was executing the arrest of Warren Selby. The team was inside an office building. Federal facility. She could see the signage in the background as the camera moved. They were moving down a corridor, fast, calling federal identification ahead of them, and then through a door into a large office with windows overlooking what looked like a military logistics facility below. The office was empty. Reeves was on her phone. Her voice was controlled and flat in the way that people's voices became controlled and flat when they were managing the specific feeling that came from a case that had just shifted underneath them. "Selby is not at the facility," she said to the room. "His keycard access shows he badged in at 0642 this morning and left at 0719. She looked up. "He was there. He left 11 minutes before the warrant team arrived." The man with no name spoke for the first time since the debrief. His voice was quiet and precise and gave nothing away. "He knew," he said. "Someone told him." The room went very still. Emily looked at the laptop screen, at the empty office, at the chair behind the desk that was pushed out at an angle, the way a chair looked when someone had stood up from it in a hurry. On the desk, a coffee cup, still steaming slightly on the live feed. 11 minutes. He'd had 11 minutes, and he'd used them, and now the man who had put her name on a target package was somewhere that wasn't his office, and wasn't in federal custody, and the case that was supposed to be closing around him had just cracked open again. She stood in the command vehicle in the mountain morning and felt the shape of the problem rearranging itself into something that was not finished, was not contained, and was not going to resolve itself in the next hour. Rex pressed against her leg. She didn't reach down. She was already thinking. The coffee cup on Selby's desk was still steaming on the live feed. That detail stayed with Emily longer than it should have. Not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. 11 minutes meant he hadn't panicked. He'd known far enough in advance to leave calmly, to finish whatever he was doing, to walk out of his own office at a pace that wouldn't draw attention from colleagues in the corridor. That was not a man who'd received bad news and run. That was a man who had been waiting for a specific signal and responded to it exactly as he'd planned. She said it before she'd fully decided to say it. He had an exit protocol. This wasn't reactive. He prepared for the possibility of the operation failing. The man with no name looked at her. It was the most attention he'd directed at her since the debrief, and it had a quality of assessment in it that she recognized from people who spent their careers evaluating other people's operational thinking. "Go on," he said. The check-in failure from Tanis's team was the trigger. He would have had a window built in, enough time to receive the signal, complete a normal departure so the building cameras showed nothing unusual, and reach whatever his fallback position is. She paused. He's not running blind. He has somewhere specific to go. Reeves was already on her phone. Morrow was looking at the laptop screen. The man with no name. She had started thinking of him as Harwick in her head, for no reason except that it was easier than no name, kept his eyes on her. The fallback position, he said. You're thinking it's prepared. I'm thinking a man who ran a diversion operation for 11 years without detection doesn't improvise his contingency. She looked at the screen, at the empty chair. He has resources outside the procurement system. The sale of the crates was going to fund something. That something already exists. Harwick looked at Morrow. A look that carried information she wasn't party to. There's a secondary property, Morrow said, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone releasing information they'd been holding. Outside our primary surveillance net. We've known about it for 6 weeks, but couldn't connect it to the procurement chain without compromising the parallel investigation. She stared at him. You knew about a fallback location, and you didn't move on it before executing the warrant. The timing was supposed to be simultaneous, Reeves said from across the table. Her voice had an edge in it that hadn't been there before. Not directed at Emily, but at the situation, at the 11 minutes, at whatever coordination failure had produced this particular morning. The secondary location team was supposed to move at the same time as the warrant team. There was a communication breakdown. A communication breakdown. 3 words that covered a gap that Selby was currently walking through. Emily looked at the laptop. The warrant team was still on screen, moving through the empty office, documenting. Too late and too thorough. Where's the secondary property? She said. That's not... Reeves started. Where is it? Harwick answered. 70 miles northeast of here. Rural property, registered to a shell company we've been tracing for 4 months. Selby has had intermittent contact with the location for the past 2 years. 70 miles northeast. Mountain terrain, she knew that area. It was the same ridge system that Harlan Ridge belonged to, running northeast in a chain of federal wilderness and private inn holdings. Remote. Road access limited. The kind of property that was either a genuine wilderness retreat or exactly what it sounded like in this context. How long to get there, she said. By air, 20 minutes, Morrow said. We have a helicopter staged from last night. Then why are we still talking? The room was quiet for a moment. Reeves looked at her. You're a witness. You're not... I'm aware of what I am, Emily said. I'm also aware that you have a subject who knows my name and my address, who is currently not in custody, and who, based on last night's target package, has demonstrated a willingness to act on that information. She kept her voice level. I'm not suggesting I lead the arrest team. I'm suggesting that standing in a command vehicle 70 miles from the only active lead in this case is not a useful contribution to resolving my personal security situation. Another silence, shorter this time. Harwick said, She goes with the tactical unit. Observer status. Reeves opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Morrow. Morrow looked at Emily for a long moment. You stay behind the tactical perimeter. You do not engage unless there is no other option. You are there because your operational read has been accurate twice in the last 18 hours, and I am not too proud to acknowledge that. Understood, she said. Rex stays here. She looked at him, thought about arguing, thought about the orthopedic mat in the back of her truck, and the fact that she'd already put him through more than his retired status warranted. Understood, she said again. She crouched down and put both hands on Rex's face, and he looked at her with his serious eyes and the specific patience of a dog who had done enough of this to know when he was being left behind for good reasons. Stay, she said. I'll come back. He sat. She straightened up and followed the tactical team out of the command vehicle into the cold morning. The helicopter was a federal unit, fast and loud, and they were in the air inside 8 minutes. Emily sat in the rear with 4 tactical agents and Harwick, who had produced a radio and a detailed topographic map of the northeastern property from somewhere in his civilian jacket, and was marking approach routes with a pen that had seen a lot of use. She looked at the map over his shoulder without asking. He angled it toward her without comment. The property was 11 acres of mixed timber and open meadow on a ridge spur, accessible by one gravel road from the south, and one fire track from the east that dead-ended a quarter-mile short of the property boundary. One structure visible on the satellite overlay, a main building, substantial, 2 stories, built into the hillside so the lower level was partially below grade. A second smaller structure that read as a garage or outbuilding, connected to the main building by what looked like a covered walkway. Below grade lower level meant the building had depth that the aerial view didn't capture. That meant she couldn't fully trust the structural picture. That was important. "What's the surveillance age on this overlay?" she said. Harwick looked at the timestamp. 43 days. "So we don't know what's been added or changed in the last 6 weeks." "Correct." "The covered walkway between the structures, can you confirm it's above grade, or is there a subsurface connection?" He looked at the overlay more carefully. "Unknown." She memorized the topography and said nothing else. They landed in a meadow a mile and a half south of the property, in terrain that put a ridge between the helicopter and the target building. The team moved fast on foot through second-growth timber, Harwick beside her, the 4 tactical agents spreading into a formation that covered ground efficiently without unnecessary noise. Her shoulder was a consistent low complaint that she managed by keeping the arm close to her body and not thinking about it. She'd functioned through worse. The fixed blade was at her hip. She had no illusions about what observer status meant if the situation went wrong. It took 22 minutes to reach the ridge above the property. From the ridge, she could see the main building clearly. Wood and stone construction, larger than it read on the overlay, with a stone chimney that was putting out smoke. Someone was home. The garage structure was closed, doors down, and she could see fresh tire tracks in the frost on the gravel road leading to it, overlaid on older tracks in a pattern that said the vehicle that made them had arrived recently. He was here. The tactical team lead, a compact woman named Driscoll, who communicated primarily in hand signals and monosyllables, and who Emily had assessed as genuinely capable within 30 seconds of meeting her, studied the property through binoculars for 4 minutes before lowering them. "One vehicle recently arrived," Driscoll said quietly. "Smoke indicates occupancy, probably single subject given the intel. 2 visible entry points on the structure. Front door south face, secondary door east face near the walkway connection." She paused. "The below-grade level is the variable. I want 2 on the east, 2 on the south, and I want that garage confirmed before we move on the main structure," Harwick said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the precision of someone who'd made enough of these decisions to have stripped all the weight out of the delivery. Driscoll nodded and gave hand signals to her team. Emily stayed on the ridge. She watched the approach through the cold morning air, tracking each agent's movement down the slope toward the structure, reading the angles and the timing. The smoke from the chimney was steady. No movement in the windows she could see from her position. Driscoll's team reached the garage first. Hand signals back up to Harwick. Clear. 1 vehicle inside, engine warm. They moved on the main structure. The south team reached the front door at the same time the east team reached the secondary entry. Driscoll's voice on the radio flat and professional. "Federal agent, search warrant, open the door." Emily heard the shot from the ridge. Single report from inside the structure, not directed outward. She could tell by the angle of the sound, directed inward. Driscoll's voice changed. "Breach! Breach!" They went in. Emily was off the ridge before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Running down the slope, fixed blade in hand, shoulder screaming, because a single shot from inside a structure with federal agents on the perimeter meant one of 2 things, and both of them required medical attention that the tactical team was not equipped to provide. She hit the front door 30 seconds behind the south team. Inside, a main room, open layout, stone fireplace with the active fire that had been making the chimney smoke, furniture, a table with a laptop that was open and running, 2 empty coffee cups that were both cold. The tactical agents were moving through to the rear of the structure, calling clear as they went. She tracked the shot by the smell, followed it through a door on the north side of the main room, down a short corridor, into a study with bookshelves and a wooden desk and a window that looked out on the covered walkway. Selby was behind the desk. He was alive. That was the first thing she assessed. Seated, slumped sideways against the chair back, left hand pressed to his right side below the rib cage, and the blood coming through his fingers was dark and moving at a rate that told her she had minutes, not much more. self-inflicted. The firearm was on the floor beside the chair where it had fallen from his right hand. He'd tried, and he'd done it wrong, which happened more than people understood. A panicked decision executed poorly. She was across the room and had her pack open before Driscoll appeared in the doorway. "He's alive," Emily said. "GSW, right lateral abdomen, possible hepatic involvement given the location. I need your medical kit, whatever you're carrying right now." Driscoll didn't ask questions. She unclipped the IFAK from her vest and put it on the desk beside Emily without breaking stride, already calling for air medical on her radio. Emily worked fast and without conversation. Gloves from her own pack. Direct pressure, both hands, feeling the anatomy under her palms the way years of practice made automatic. The entry wound was low enough that the liver was a real possibility. Dark blood and the location together said maybe, not definitely, which meant maybe she had more time than the worst-case read suggested, or maybe she had less. Selby looked at her. His face was gray and damp, and he was working to stay conscious in the way that people did when some part of them understood that unconsciousness was a step in a direction they weren't ready to go. "Who are you?" he said, barely audible. "I'm the nurse from the mountain," she said, flat, focused, not looking at his face. "Don't talk." A pause in which she felt him processing that. "You're the one who—" He stopped, breathed. "You found the crates." "Don't talk," she said again. "I didn't—" He stopped again. His breathing was wrong in a way she didn't like, a shallow, rapid quality that suggested the diaphragm was involved, or that shock was progressing faster than the blood loss alone accounted for. "I didn't know about the target package. Last night, on the mountain. I didn't authorize— I said don't talk." "Tanis," he said, and his voice dropped further. "Tanis added you. I didn't— That wasn't my— Selby." She looked at him now, directly, because sometimes that was what kept a person in their body when everything else was pulling them out of it. "I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" He looked at her. His eyes were still tracking, still present. "You're keeping me alive," he said, and she couldn't tell if it was a question or a realization. "That's my job," she said. "Let me do it." He closed his eyes, but his chest kept moving, and she kept her hands where they were and listened to Driscoll coordinating air medical outside the door and felt the minutes moving in the particular slow, fast way they moved when someone's life was in the balance and the next resource was still in the air. Harwick appeared in the doorway. He looked at Selby. He looked at Emily's hands. He looked at the firearm on the floor. "How long?" he said. "Air medical?" 6 minutes out. She assessed the pressure under her palms, the rate, the color of what was coming through the dressing. "He'll make it if they're actually 6 minutes. Talk to me about what he said." She kept her eyes on Selby. "He said Tanis added me to the target package without his authorization." "You believe him?" She thought about the shape of the operation, about a man who had run a sophisticated procurement fraud for 11 years, who had built exit protocols and fallback properties and shell companies, a man who was precise and patient and methodical. Then she thought about last night, the East Perimeter, the timing, the direct aggression of it, the way it felt different from the rest of the operation, less controlled. "I think it's possible," she said. "Tanis has a pattern of operational escalation. The fraud chain was careful. Last night wasn't careful." Harwick nodded slowly. He looked at Selby, who had not opened his eyes, but whose chest was still rising and falling. "If Tanis acted unilaterally," Harwick said, "it changes the charge structure significantly." "I'm aware," she said. "I'm also not particularly interested in the charge structure right now." He almost said something and then didn't. He went back to the doorway. She kept her hands where they were and counted seconds and listened to the property outside go quiet around the sound of boots and radio traffic, and somewhere, in the distance, the growing mechanical thrum of an incoming helicopter. 4 minutes later, the air medical team came through the door, and she stepped back and gave them the handoff in the compact professional shorthand of people who spoke the same clinical language: mechanism, vitals as observed, estimated blood loss, interventions applied, her assessment of hepatic involvement, and why. The lead medic, a young man who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this in difficult environments for long enough that nothing surprised him, looked at her briefly as he took over. "Good work on the pressure. You kept the rate down." "He kept himself cooperative," she said. "That helped." She stepped back against the bookshelf and let them work. Her gloves were dark and her hands were shaking slightly, which she registered without judgment. The adrenaline finding its way out now that the acute task was over, which was normal and human, and not something she'd ever fully trained out of herself, nor tried to. She peeled the gloves off and looked at her hands. Steady enough. The shaking was in the forearms, deeper, the kind that didn't show unless you knew to look for it. Harwick came back into the room. He was looking at his phone. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, which was show something. "What?" she said. He looked up. "Tanis," he said. "He was being transported to Federal Holding 40 minutes ago. There was an incident during transport." She felt the bottom of the sentence before he said the rest of it. "He's out," Harwick said. 3 men, ambush on the transport route. 2 federal marshals are down. Tanis is gone." The room was suddenly very loud with the sounds of the medical team working on Selby, and very quiet with everything else. And Emily stood against the bookshelf with her shaking forearms and her dark gloves in her hand and understood that the shape of the problem had just rearranged itself again into something sharper and more immediate than anything that had come before. Tanis was out. Tanis, who had put her name on a target package without authorization. Tanis, who was not methodical, or patient, or precise. Tanis, who was none of those things, and who was now free, and who knew her name, and who knew her address in Caldwell, and who had already demonstrated exactly what he was willing to do about people who became inconvenient. She looked at Harwick. "Rex is on the mountain," she said, and the look on Harwick's face told her that he'd already thought of that, and that thought was not a comfortable one. She was already moving toward the door when Harwick caught her arm. "The mountain site has security," he said. "Rex is with trained personnel." "Tanis knows that site," she said. "He built his operation around knowing where the federal response came from. If he's running and he wants leverage, that site is exactly where he goes." She pulled her arm free. "Not aggressive, just certain. And Rex is not a trained agent. He's a retired military dog in the care of skeleton federal staff at a location that just lost 4 of its perimeter personnel to transport duty." Harwick looked at her for 1 second. Then he was on his radio. She heard him request immediate security reinforcement to the Harlan Ridge Access Road site, priority routing, and then request a second helicopter for return transport. His voice was unhurried and precise, and she noticed that he didn't argue with her read. He just acted on it, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the Tanis variable. The air medical team had Selby on a stretcher and was moving him toward the exterior door. She stepped aside and watched them go. He was unconscious now. Blood pressure had dropped in the last 2 minutes, the hepatic involvement more likely than not. But his chest was still moving, and the lead medic had told her the hospital was 12 minutes out by air, and 12 minutes was workable if they moved fast. Workable, not certain. She'd learned a long time ago to stop confusing those two things. The study without Selby in it felt smaller somehow. The fire was still going in the main room. The laptop on the table was still open and running, and she noticed as she passed it that the screen showed an encrypted messaging application with a conversation thread that the federal forensics team was going to find very informative. Outside, the cold hit her again. She was tired in a way that had moved past the kind of tired that coffee addressed, into the deeper kind that only sleep fixed, and sleep was not available. Her shoulder had progressed from complaint to insistence. She rolled it once, felt the grinding catch that meant something in there was inflamed and annoyed, and made a note to deal with it when this was over. The return helicopter was 8 minutes out. She stood in the frost-covered meadow below the property and watched Driscoll's team work the exterior and thought about Tanis. She hadn't met him directly. She'd seen him on the access road from a distance during the original operation. One of the contractor team, she'd cataloged him as mid-rank, capable, the kind of man who was good at executing plans other people made. What Selby had said in the study, half delirious with blood loss, tracked with that read. Tanis as implementer, who'd made an unilateral decision about the target package when the operation started failing. The escalation of last night, the East Perimeter breach, the direct aggression, that was someone improvising under pressure, not someone executing a prepared plan. Improvising under pressure was dangerous in a different way than methodical was dangerous. Methodical, you could predict. Improvised, you could only react to. The helicopter came in, and they were back in the air before she'd fully processed the shift from standing still to moving. Harwick sat across from her. He was on his phone for the first 4 minutes of the flight, a series of short clipped exchanges that she caught fragments of. Transport route, last confirmed vehicle, cell data, the name Tanis repeated several times with the particular flat emphasis of a name that had become a problem. He hung up and looked at her. The transport ambush used a stolen emergency services vehicle, he said. Ambulance, with functional lights and markings. The marshals pulled over for it on a single-lane section of the transport route. He paused. Tanis had that prepared before his arrest, which means he expected to be taken into custody. She absorbed that. He had an extraction protocol, built before he knew the crates were compromised. This was his contingency for operational failure at any stage. Harwick looked at his phone, then put it away. We underestimated his preparation level. Everyone kept calling him a cleaner, she said. Cleaners don't build extraction protocols. He was running his own operation parallel to Selby's. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. We're arriving at that conclusion. 14 months, she said. You were watching for 14 months, and you didn't see that. He looked at her directly. No, he said. We didn't. No deflection, no qualification, just the fact of it, acknowledged. She looked out the helicopter window at the mountain terrain moving below them, the ridge system running northeast to southwest, the tree canopy unbroken except for the cuts of fire roads and the gray thread of the highway far below. The crates, she said. The sale he was arranging. Who was buying? That's still developing. But you have a direction. Harwick was quiet for 2 seconds too long. We have a direction, he said. She didn't push it. Whatever the buyer situation was, it was above her immediate problem, and her immediate problem was a man with an extraction protocol and her home address who was currently not in federal custody. They landed at the Harlan Ridge access road site 18 minutes after leaving the meadow. She was out of the helicopter before the rotors had fully cycled down. The site looked different from how she'd left it. More vehicles, more personnel, the skeleton overnight staffing replaced by a full operational presence that had been ramping up since the transport ambush came over the wire. She scanned the perimeter first, reading the coverage, assessing the gaps the same way she'd assessed them the night before from a different position. Rex was where she'd left him. A federal agent she didn't recognize was sitting on the command vehicle running board with him, which told her someone had taken the security reinforcement request seriously enough to put a body on the dog specifically, which was either thoughtful or a sign of how well they'd read her earlier transmission about his location. He saw her coming and stood up from his sit, and she put her hand on his head and felt him lean into it. Good boy, she said. I know. He pushed his nose against her collarbone, and she let him. Morrow found her 2 minutes later. He looked like he hadn't slept, which was accurate, and he had the expression of a man managing more problems than he had hands for. Selby is in surgery, he said. Preliminary prognosis is cautious. He needs to survive, she said. He's the only principal who can give you the full procurement chain from the inside. I know that. A pause. He said something before they sedated him. His attending called Reeves directly. He looked at her carefully. He said the buyer for the crates was a domestic organization, not foreign, not state-sponsored, someone inside the country who needed military-grade explosive capability and had the money to pay procurement channel prices for it. She let that sit for a moment. Domestic. Which meant the threat the crates represented wasn't about foreign intelligence or international trafficking. It was something closer, which was in some ways considerably worse. Did he give a name? A partial. Reeves is running it. Morrow looked toward the command vehicle. What I'm about to tell you is not for general circulation. She waited. The partial name Selby gave connects to an infrastructure target list that's been on a domestic threat monitoring file for 8 months. A group that has been in the planning phase for something significant. The crates were the missing component. He paused. If the sale had completed, it didn't, she said. No. He looked at her. Because you found them. She didn't have anything to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She looked at the evidence truck, which was still on site pending full forensic documentation, the 8 crates inside it already processed and cataloged. 16 units of military explosive that had not reached whoever had ordered them. The weight of that specific fact was something she was going to put down and not pick back up, because picking it up and carrying it around was not useful and was in fact the kind of thing that made people stop being able to do the job in front of them. She put it down. Tanis, she said, still no location. Cell data puts his last known position 40 miles south of here 2 hours ago. He abandoned the stolen ambulance at a rural property and took a vehicle from the property. The owners were restrained. They're both unharmed. He paused. He's moving. Direction unclear. She thought about what she knew about Tanis. Extraction protocol, prepared before arrest, which meant it wasn't a reaction to the current situation. It was a pre-built route. Pre-built routes had endpoints. Endpoints that were chosen in advance meant they were significant to the person who chose them, not random safe houses. Places that meant something operationally. She thought about the second vehicle at the original access road. The green pickup had been the crate transport, but there had been another vehicle. She'd registered it peripherally and filed it because at the time it wasn't the priority. A second set of tire tracks on the access road, older, overlaid by the newer ones from the morning of the operation. Was a second vehicle documented at the original access road site? She said. Morrow looked at her. The forensics team logged 2 distinct tread patterns on the fire road. The pickups in another vehicle, older impressions, probably 12 to 24 hours prior. Tanis was at that site before the operation, she said. Pre-positioning, he knew the terrain. Yes, which means he knows this terrain, this ridge system. She looked at the tree line around the access road clearing. An extraction route through federal wilderness land doesn't show up on cell data. It doesn't require roads. And if you pre-positioned resources in this terrain before the operation went active, she stopped. Morrow was very still. She turned and looked at the ridge above the access road site. The same ridge she'd used the day before. The same timber, the same rock faces, the same natural approach routes she'd exploited when the contractor teams were sweeping the mountain. If Tanis had been in this terrain 24 hours before the original operation, if he'd walked those approach routes, if he'd seen what the terrain offered someone who knew how to use it. He's not moving south, she said. The cell data is old. He abandoned the vehicle 2 hours ago. On foot through wilderness terrain, 2 hours puts him Norris. How many personnel do you have on the north and west perimeter right now? Morrow turned to look at the perimeter layout, and she could see in the speed of his turn that he was doing the same math she'd just done. He grabbed his radio. All units, this is Morrow. I need immediate head count on north and west perimeter. The radio crackled. North perimeter, 2 agents, confirmed. West perimeter. A pause that was 1 second too long. West perimeter agent's voice tighter than it should be. I've got movement in the west timber. 40 yards, maybe less. I can't... Wait. The transmission cut. Everyone in the clearing heard it cut. For approximately 2 seconds, nobody moved, because 2 seconds was how long it took a group of trained professionals to process the specific silence of a radio that had been transmitting, and then wasn't. Then Morrow was issuing commands and agents were moving, and Emily was already running toward the west tree line because west was where the north slope drainage ran. And the north slope drainage was the approach she would have used if she was coming in from a pre-positioned cache in the wilderness terrain above the site, because it gave cover all the way to 40 yards from the perimeter edge, and 40 yards in timber at night was nothing. She heard Rex behind her. She hadn't released him, and she hadn't given him a command, and he was running with her anyway, because he'd been doing this long enough to know what running toward the tree line meant, and because some part of his training had never fully retired. She hit the tree line at a run and pulled up behind a fir trunk and listened. To her left, 20 yards, she heard the sound of a single person moving through the timber. Not fast, not panicked, but deliberate, changing direction, the sound of someone who knew they'd been heard and was adjusting. She gave Rex the hand signal, not the full engagement command, the locate signal, track and indicate without contact. He dropped his nose and was gone into the timber shadow in 4 seconds. She moved parallel, keeping the sound of his movement on her left, using him as a direction indicator the way she had in training environments years ago. He would find the person before she did. He would indicate. She would follow the indication. 40 yards into the timber, she saw Rex stop. He was sitting. Alert sit, not aggressive, nose pointing forward and slightly left, the way he'd been trained to indicate a located subject rather than attack without command. She moved to his position and looked where he was pointing. Tanis was 8 feet away, pressed against a rock face, and he had a sidearm raised and pointed at Rex, and his hand was shaking in a way that told her several things at once. That he was exhausted, that he was operating on the back end of a sustained adrenaline cycle that was failing him, and that a shaking hand on a firearm pointed at her dog was the most dangerous configuration she could currently be facing, because shaking hands did not make controlled decisions. Tanis, she said, flat, even. Nothing in it that would spike his adrenaline further. He swung the weapon toward her voice. She was already clear of the line she'd spoken from, 2 feet left, which was instinct and was why she was still standing. The barrel tracked and didn't find her. Put it down, she said, from the new position. Where are you? His voice was rough. Dehydrated, she assessed. He'd been moving through wilderness terrain for 2 hours in near-freezing temperatures with whatever he'd been carrying when the transport vehicle was ambushed. He was not in good shape. I'm right here, she said. She stepped into the edge of his visible range deliberately, hands visible, no sudden movement, giving him something to look at. You're done running. There are 12 federal agents between you and any route out of this terrain. You know that. He looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed, and the shaking in his hand had moved into his forearm. The weapon was still up, but the angle was wrong. Not trained, not precise. Survivable if he fired, probably. She ran that calculation quickly and didn't love the probably. You're the nurse, he said. Yes. You're the one who found the crates. Yes. He stared at her. She watched his face move through several things, exhaustion, calculation, something that was almost disbelief. You were just hiking, he said. You were supposed to be nobody. I know, she said. Walk away from the weapon. I'll make sure the agents who come in next don't hurt you. That's what I can offer you. That's it? That's it. She kept her eyes on his. But it's real. And it's better than what you have right now. The weapon stayed up for 4 more seconds. She counted them. Then his arm dropped. Not dramatically, just ran out of the energy required to hold the position. The firearm lowered to his side and he put his back against the rock face and slid down it until he was sitting on the frozen ground, and he looked at her with the face of a man who had built a sophisticated operational structure over years and watched it come apart in 36 hours because of a woman who had come up the mountain to clear her head. Rex was still in his alert sit. She put her hand on his back. Good boy, she said quietly. She keyed her radio. Norris, West Timber, 40 yards in, subject located and disarmed. I need a team. Morrow's voice came back immediately. Strained, contained, the sound of someone who'd spent 30 seconds not knowing where she was. Copy. Team is moving. Are you injured? She thought about her shoulder, about the dried blood on her jacket from Selby's study, about the 36 hours of accumulated costs that her body was going to present her with a full accounting of the moment this was genuinely over. Negative, she said. Come get him. She stood over Tanis in the cold timber and waited, and Rex sat at her heel and waited with her, and the sound of boots coming through the trees from the east was the most ordinary and welcome sound she'd heard in a day and a half. The agents came in with weapons drawn, and she stepped back and let them work, and watched Tanis get taken into custody with the particular exhausted resignation of a man who had nothing left to run on. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He went with them the way people went when the calculation was finally and completely finished. Harwick appeared at the tree-line edge as the agents moved Tanis out toward the clearing. He looked at Emily, at Rex, at the rock face where Tanis had been sitting. He came back to the site, he said. Not a question. Working it out. Pre-positioned cache, probably, she said. Documents, money, maybe a second communication device. He needed what he'd left here before he could run any further. She paused. He ran out of time. Harwick nodded slowly. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing quality she'd gotten used to from him. You should know, he said, that the partial name Selby gave us, Reeves's team, Got a full identification 20 minutes ago. Arrest warrant is being executed right now. The buyer. He paused. The procurement chain is closed. She absorbed that. All of it. The crates, the chain, the buyer, Tanis, Selby and surgery, the 14 months of parallel investigation, and the 36 hours that had collapsed it all into resolution. The shape of it. Complete. It's over? She said. Harwick looked at her steadily. The field operation is over. She nodded. She knew what came after that. The depositions, the testimony, the legal process that would run for months while she went back to her shifts at Ridgecrest Valley Medical Center, and her apartment in Caldwell, and her life that she had built to be quiet. She looked down at Rex. He was looking up at her patient, ready, his serious face and his calm eyes and his complete uncomplicated presence that had been the most consistent thing in a day and a half of nothing being consistent. She put her hand on his head. "Come on," she said. "Let's go in." They walked out of the timber together into the cold gray morning, and behind them the federal team was processing Tanis, and ahead of them the clearing was full of vehicles and agents and the organized machinery of a case that was finally, thoroughly, coming closed. She was halfway across the clearing when Morrow fell into step beside her, and she could tell before he spoke that whatever he was about to say was not part of the wrapping up. "There's someone here," he said. "He arrived while you were in the timber. He asked for you specifically." She looked at him. "Who?" Morrow's expression did the thing it had done on the access road when he'd told her there would be conversations she hadn't anticipated. That careful, weighted look. "Brigadier General Thomas Waverly," he said. "Inspector General's office. He flew in from the capital this morning." He paused. "He said he's been aware of your situation since the beacon registered. He said there are things about your separation from service that need to be addressed." Another pause, and this one had more weight in it than any of the others. "He brought your file, Emily. The full file, the parts that were blacked out." She stopped walking. Rex stopped with her. "Rex?" She stood in the middle of the access road, clearing with the mountain cold around her and the federal operation moving on all sides, and felt the particular stillness of a person who has spent 2 years building a specific kind of life and is standing at the moment where that life is about to change in ways she hadn't prepared for and couldn't yet see the full shape of. "Where is he?" she said. Morrow pointed toward the far end of the clearing where a dark blue sedan sat apart from the federal vehicles, clean and out of place among the muddy tactical trucks, the way a formal letter looks out of place in a pile of field reports. A man stood beside it, tall, late 50s, in a service uniform that had not been worn on a helicopter this morning without intention. Brigadier General Thomas Waverly had dressed for this. That told her something before she'd taken 20 steps toward him. Rex walked at her heel. She hadn't told him to. He'd decided. Waverly watched her cross the clearing. He didn't move toward her, didn't close the distance, which she understood as a form of respect, letting her set the pace of an approach she hadn't asked for. She noted it. She didn't soften because of it, but she noted it. She stopped 4 feet from him. Close enough for conversation, far enough to make a point she hadn't consciously decided to make until she was already making it. He looked at her the way people looked at someone they'd read extensively on paper and were now reconciling with the actual human being. She'd seen that look before, from people who'd accessed her file. It usually contained some version of surprise, because the file described things that didn't square with what 29-year-old women in hiking boots generally looked like. "General," she said. "Staff Sergeant Norris," he said, then caught himself. "Emily." "What's in the file?" she said. She wasn't interested in the approach. She wanted the information. He reached into the sedan and produced a manila folder, actual paper, which was either procedural habit or a deliberate choice about how this conversation should feel. He held it out to her. She took it, opened it. The first page was her service record, unredacted. She'd seen the redacted version when she separated, the version that had large sections replaced with black bars that told you something existed without telling you what it was. The unredacted version was considerably longer, and she stood in the mountain cold and read it with the particular careful attention she gave to things that mattered, which was the same attention she gave to everything, which was part of why she was still alive and functional after the last 36 hours. It took her 4 minutes to read it, When she looked up, Waverly was watching her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not fully succeeding. My separation was flagged, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd suspected it for 2 years without having confirmation. Someone in the chain marked my record to limit my civilian opportunities. Yes, he said. Who? He was quiet for a moment. Colonel Dale Pruitt, retired 14 months ago. He was the commanding officer of your unit during your final deployment. She knew the name. She had a complete and specific set of memories attached to it that she was not going to access right now in the middle of a federal crime scene. Why? She said. Waverly looked at the folder in her hands. You filed an internal report during your final deployment regarding procurement irregularities in your unit's supply chain. He paused. The report was suppressed. Pruitt suppressed it. What you observed and documented in that report connects directly to the procurement fraud network that Warren Selby was operating. She stood very still. I reported it 6 years ago, she said. Yes. And someone buried it. Pruitt buried it. And then he flagged your record on separation to ensure that if you ever surfaced the information again through civilian channels, your credibility would be manageable. Waverly's voice was careful and flat, and she could hear under the flatness the particular discomfort of a man delivering information about institutional failure from within the institution that failed. The flag affected your nursing licensure application timeline. It affected 2 employment reference checks that you never knew happened. It was designed to keep you small and quiet and easily dismissed. The word dismissed landed with a specific weight. She thought about the 2 years in Caldwell, about the performance review that called her difficult to engage informally, about the ways she'd made herself smaller, no discussion of before, no explanation for the competencies that made her coworkers occasionally uncertain around her, the careful construction of a life that asked nothing from anyone who might look too closely. She thought about Whitfield's voice on the phone. Are you all right? The same reflex he used for hand hygiene reminders, but genuine underneath. She thought about Rex, who was pressing his weight against her left leg with the specific firmness he used when he decided she needed it and was going to provide it whether she asked or not. Pruitt, she said. Where is he now? In federal custody as of 90 minutes ago, Waverly said. The connection between his suppression of your report and the Selby procurement network was established last week by Harwick's team. The arrest was held pending the resolution of the field operation. He paused. He's been charged with obstruction, conspiracy, and accessory to procurement fraud. The sentencing guidelines for the combined charges are significant. She closed the folder. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel, which was some version of vindication that arrived with heat and clarity. What she felt was quieter than that and harder to name, something like a long-held breath finally released, except that releasing it revealed how much the holding had cost, which was the part she hadn't let herself calculate while she was still holding it. What happens to my record? She said. That's why I'm here, Waverly said. The Inspector General's office has the authority to formally expunge the flag and restore the original commendation citations that were removed at separation. The process requires your signature on 3 documents and takes effect immediately upon my return to the capital. He paused. There's more. She waited. The IG's office is recommending a formal citation for what you did on this mountain. Separate from the record restoration. A public commendation, on record, for preventing the completion of a domestic terrorism supply chain. He looked at her directly. It would be the second time you've been cited for actions that most people in your position would not have taken, the first time it was classified. This one won't be. She thought about public, about Caldwell, about the careful, quiet life. I'm a nurse, she said. I know. I'm going back to my job. I'm going back to my shifts and my patients and my apartment. She said it not defensively, but as information, the way she'd delivered information throughout the last 36 hours. A public citation doesn't change that. No, he said, it doesn't, but it does mean that the next time someone runs a background check on Emily Norris, what they find is the truth. He let that sit for a moment. You spent 2 years being smaller than you are because someone with authority decided your truth was inconvenient. The citation doesn't fix that retroactively, but it means it doesn't happen again. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Give me the documents." She signed them on the hood of his sedan with a pen that had run low on ink and required 2 attempts on the third signature, which was the kind of small, undignified detail that real moments always contained, and that she found, unexpectedly, almost a relief. Nothing about the last 2 years had been clean or simple, and there was something appropriate about closing it with a pen that was nearly out of ink. Waverly took the documents. He shook her hand. Firm, direct, no performance in it. She respected that. "One more thing," he said. He reached into the sedan again and produced a small, hard case, military issue, the kind used for medals and commendation items. He set it on the hood between them. "This was removed from your record at separation along with the citations. It belongs to you." She opened the case. Inside was a service commendation medal she'd been told had been administratively removed from her file. She'd been told administrative error. She'd known it wasn't an error. She'd put that knowledge in the same place she put a lot of things and had not taken it back out. She looked at it for a moment, then she closed the case. "Thank you," she said. She meant it, but not in the way he probably heard it. She meant it for the truth of the thing, not the thing itself. The medal was metal. The truth was the part that had mattered. She put the case in her pack and walked back toward the center of the clearing. Rex fell in beside her. The federal operation ran through the afternoon. She was present for the parts that required her and absent from the parts that didn't. And gradually, the extraordinary machinery of the last 36 hours began its process of converting itself into paperwork and procedure and the long institutional work of prosecution. Reeves briefed her on the legal timeline, standing beside the evidence truck in the late afternoon light. Depositions would begin in 3 weeks. Her testimony would be required at 2 separate proceedings, the Tanis prosecution and the Selby case, assuming Selby survived surgery, which as of 4 o'clock the answer was yes. He'd come through and was in the ICU with a prognosis that had moved from cautious to probable. Pruitt's case was separate and would run on a different schedule. She would be contacted. "You're comfortable with all of it?" Reeves said. "I'm not comfortable with any of it," Emily said. "I'll do it anyway." Reeves looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said, and then paused in a way that suggested she didn't often say things like what came next. "What you did on this mountain, most trained personnel in your position would have secured the scene and waited. You saw the shape of the problem faster than anyone with full situational awareness and better equipment." She paused again. "I wanted to say that before you drive away and go back to being a nurse." Emily looked at her. "I've always been a nurse," she said. "It wasn't going back to anything." Reeves nodded once. Something shifted in her expression that was close to respect and was genuine rather than professional. "Safe drive," she said, and went back to her work. She left the mountain at 6 in the evening. The drive down to the highway took 30 minutes on gravel that had turned soft in the afternoon temperature rise, and she took it slowly because she was tired enough that careful was the right speed. Rex slept in the back seat before she'd reached the highway junction, the deep, immediate sleep of a dog who had expended himself fully and had no complicated feelings about needing rest. She drove south on the highway with the heater running and the radio off. The mountains came down around her in the long, slow descent toward lower elevation, and then were behind her, and the landscape opened into the broad valley that led eventually to Caldwell, and she drove through it in the winter dark and thought about the things she'd learned to think about carefully so they didn't overtake her. Pruitt. 6 years of carrying a suppressed report and a flagged record, and the knowledge that she'd done the right thing in a way that had cost her without ever being acknowledged as right. She didn't feel anger about it with the heat she might have expected. What she felt was something more complicated, a kind of grief for the years of being smaller than she was, combined with the hard knowledge that those years had also made her who she was, and who she was had just prevented something that she wasn't going to think too directly about, because thinking too directly about it made the scale of it difficult to hold. The things you pay for being the person who does the right thing don't come back to you. That was true. Pruitt was in custody and her record was restored, but she didn't get the 2 years back, didn't get the employment check she never knew about, didn't get the version of her life that might have been different if the flag hadn't been there. Those were gone. The acknowledgement didn't undo them. But the acknowledgement was real, and the truth was on record. And the people who had built their position on the assumption that she would stay small and quiet and easily dismissed had discovered the particular problem with that assumption. She was not small. She was not quiet in the ways that mattered, and she was not easily anything. She thought about what Reeves had said. Most trained personnel would have secured the scene and waited. She thought about what Tanis had said in the timber, with his shaking hand and his failed extraction and his voice rough from 2 hours in mountain cold. You were supposed to be nobody. She'd spent 2 years trying to be nobody. Not out of fear, out of the belief that the quiet life was the earned life, the right life after everything before it. That there was integrity in setting the capability down and becoming ordinary. That ordinary was its own kind of strength. She still believed that. She also believed that when ordinary became the hiding place rather than the choice, it stopped being strength and started being something else. Something Pruitt had counted on. Something Selby's operation had counted on. The assumption that a person who had been pushed down once would stay down because down was easier. She hadn't stayed down. She'd just been hiking. But when the morning required her to be what she actually was, she'd been it without hesitation. And that was its own kind of answer to a question she hadn't known she'd been asking for 2 years. She reached Caldwell at 9:15. The city looked like itself. The familiar grid of lights, the highway interchange, the industrial south end giving way to the residential streets, and eventually the older neighborhood where her apartment building sat back from a quiet street with a parking lot that was never quite full, and a building manager named Roy who left her alone and accepted packages when she was on shift. She parked, sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. Rex raised his head from the back seat, looked at her. "We're home," she said. He accepted this and put his head back down. She picked up her phone. 12 missed calls. Reeves twice, Morrow 4 times, 2 numbers she didn't recognize that were probably federal contacts, and then, at the bottom of the list, 1 call from a Caldwell number she did recognize. Whitfield. Called at 2 in the afternoon, no voicemail. She called him back. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been near his phone. "Norris," he said, "I saw something on the Federal News Wire. A statement about a counterterrorism operation in the Harlan Ridge Wilderness area." A pause. It mentioned a civilian witness with medical training. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm home," she said. "I'm fine." "The coverage for your shift is handled," he said. "Don't come in until you're ready." "Friday," she said. "I'll be in Friday." "Good." He paused, and she could hear him deciding something. The statement said the witness preserved critical evidence and provided emergency medical care under active threat conditions. His voice was careful in the way voices became careful around information that was rearranging a previous picture. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" She thought about it. "Not tonight," she said. "I'll tell you what I can when I'm back." "All right," he said, and then in the tone that she'd finally understood was just who he was. "I'm glad you're safe." "Thank you, Donald," she said. She hung up and sat in the parking lot dark with Rex's steady breathing from the back seat and the familiar smell of her own truck and the specific weight of a body that had been running on necessity for 36 hours and was now, finally, running out of anything to run on. She would sleep. She would eat something and sleep. She would call Reeves in the morning and begin the process of depositions and testimony and the long legal unwinding of a case that had started 6 years ago with a report she'd filed in good faith and that had taken this long to find its way to the light. Tanis would be prosecuted on charges of escape, assault on federal officers, conspiracy, and the specific count relating to the target package that had put her name in a file alongside her home address. The sentencing guidelines Morrow had cited were not small numbers. Gregor Tanis was going to spend a significant portion of whatever remained of his operational life in a federal facility, and the men who'd ambushed the transport and the men from the access road perimeter breach and the 4 from the timber slopes were all part of a case file that was now closed and documented and being prepared for prosecution by Dana Reeves, who was thorough and precise and would not leave holes. Warren Selby would survive his surgery. He would testify. The procurement chain he'd built over 11 years, the shell companies and the logistics contacts and the facility insiders who had helped move 16 units of military explosive toward a domestic buyer who had needed them for something that would not now happen. All of it would surface in a federal proceeding that would be a matter of public record. The buyer's organization, already in custody, would face charges that reflected the severity of what they'd been attempting. The full weight of that was something she was choosing not to carry, because carrying it wasn't her job, and her job was specific, and she was good at it, and she was going back to it. Dale Pruitt would stand in a federal courtroom, and the record of what he'd done, the suppressed report, the flag separation, the years of quiet institutional retaliation against a person who'd done what the system asked and been punished for it, would be part of the public proceedings. Whatever his lawyers argued, whatever framing they constructed, the facts were documented. Her report from 6 years ago was on record. His suppression of it was on record. The flag on her service file was on record, and the removal of that flag was on record, signed by a brigadier general at the direction of the inspector general's office. The truth was on record. That was the thing, she thought. That was the part that mattered beyond the sentences and the custody and the legal architecture of consequence. The truth being on record meant it couldn't be revised, couldn't be managed or suppressed or explained away by someone with the authority to put black bars over inconvenient facts. It existed in the permanent way that documented truth existed, accessible to anyone who needed to know that a nurse in Caldwell had once filed a report that was right and had been punished for being right and had gone on being right anyway. She got out of the truck. The cold air hit her and she was glad of it, one last moment of mountain air before the warmth of the building. She opened the back door and Rex climbed down with the careful deliberateness of a dog whose joints were feeling the day, and she let him take his time. They walked to the building entrance together. Roy had left the entry light on, which he always did when she was on night shifts, a habit he'd started without being asked and that she'd never commented on because some things you just received. Inside, she fed Rex his evening meal and watched him eat with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. And then she sat on the floor of her kitchen with her back against the cabinet and her legs out straight and her head tipped back because the floor was where she ended up when she was too tired for chairs and honest about it. Rex finished eating. He came and lay down beside her, his full weight pressed against her side, his head on her thigh. She put her hand on his back. She thought about what Waverly had said. You spent 2 years being smaller than you are. She thought about how that had felt from the inside. Not small, not exactly, but contained, managed. A careful rationing of herself that she'd told herself was maturity, and that was at least partly just fear. Fear that the full version of who she was had no place in a life that was supposed to be quiet. That competence at a certain level was something you owed an apology for, something to be kept out of view so that ordinary life could continue without the disruption of what you actually were. The mountain had answered that question in the most definitive way she could imagine. She wasn't going to spend the next 2 years being smaller than she was. She wasn't going to over-explain herself to Whitfield or hide her read of a situation because it came faster than made people comfortable or apologize by silence for being the person who understood what the crates meant and knew what to do about it. She was a nurse. She was going back to her patients and her ER floor and her shift rotation and the specific demanding work of keeping people alive in the hours when their bodies were failing them, which was the work she had chosen and was good at and valued. She was also everything else, and those things were no longer separate compartments. They were the same person. They had always been the same person. She was done pretending otherwise. Rex exhaled against her leg, the long, slow breath he used when he'd decided everything was sufficiently accounted for and rest was appropriate. She smiled. Not widely. She was too tired for wide. Just enough. Yeah, she said. I know. She'd go back to work on Friday. She'd do the depositions. She'd testify and tell the truth the way she always had, at cost sometimes without apology. She'd take Rex to the park on her days off and let him run the long grass near the river the way he liked to, with his ears back and his stride loosening into something that looked almost like joy. She'd carry what needed carrying and put down what didn't. And the next time someone looked at her, at the nurse in the hiking boots, the quiet woman with the serious eyes who kept to herself and was hard to read, and didn't explain herself in the ways people expected, and decided she was nobody, she wouldn't correct them. She'd just be exactly what she was. And that, she had learned on a mountain on a morning that had not been what she'd planned, was enough. More than enough. It always had been. The only thing that had ever needed to change was who got to decide that. She had decided it now. She closed her eyes, and Rex breathed steadily beside her, and outside the window of her apartment in Caldwell, the ordinary night continued its ordinary work. And Emily Norris, nurse, veteran, the woman on the mountain who had never been nobody, finally let herself rest.